Yes, nodding heads. Okay, good. Well, thank you very much for coming today. I thought I would start off my presentation a bit differently. I'd like to do a little quiz. So if you could raise your hand if you have heard of something called the withdrawal agreement. Has anyone heard this term? Okay, so most people in the room. Okay. Of those of you that raised your hands, how many of you feel confident that you know what the withdrawal agreement means for you personally? I don't see it. Okay. Well, that's why I'm here today. And again, with a show of hands, who in the room just feels generally a little bit confused about Brexit? Right, okay, well, so the idea of my presentation today is to give you some general information, okay? As Sarah Jane said, I'm going to give you some general information about what we already know. At the end, I will be here, and I will be here to answer your questions. Everyone has very specific circumstances, every individual is different. So rather than doing a question and answer, come and see me at the end, and I will be able to answer your questions or point you in the direction of people who can, okay? But in today's presentation, I would like to cover a couple of different areas. So number one, the withdrawal agreement. I think we've established that it would be good to say a few words about that. I'd also like to talk about what's not included in the withdrawal agreement and why that might be of interest to some of you here. I'd like to say a few words about no deal and what that potentially could mean for you as UK nationals here in Spain. And at the end, I'm going to go on to talk about what you can do in order to stay up to date with the latest information, because I understand that the situation can be confusing. So let's start off with the withdrawal agreement. So when the UK voted to leave the EU, the negotiations were split into two different parts. The first part was about how we leave the EU, our exit. And the second part of negotiations is about our future relationship. Now, the negotiations are still essentially in that first part. They're talking about the UK's exit from the EU. And that's where the withdrawal agreement comes in. The withdrawal agreement itself basically embodies the way in which the UK is going to leave the EU. Now, citizens' rights is something which has been talked about a lot, but some people are not really quite sure what that means. Now, last December, the UK and the EU reached an agreement on citizens' rights specifically. So that's the rights of UK nationals living in the EU and EU nationals living in the UK. And I'm going to come on to talk about that in a minute. The withdrawal agreement will also include something called an implementation or a transition period. So some of you may have heard this term. Basically, when we triggered what's called Article 50 in order to leave the EU, that will stop. That means we leave the EU in March of 2019, so March next year. But the implementation period or transition period will run from March 2019 until December of 2020. And in the event of a deal, in the event of the withdrawal agreement all being signed off, it essentially means that nothing will really change until the end of 2020. But what does this all actually mean for you as UK nationals living here in Spain? So the withdrawal agreement actually covers some really important rights, and I want to cover off some of those now. Number one is probably the most important one, about residency. So the withdrawal agreement says that anyone who is legally resident here by the end of 2020 will have the right to remain to live in Spain. Now that's an important one, I think. Number two, pensions. Is anybody here in receipt of a UK state pension? Okay, quite a few people. So you might notice that on a year-to-year basis, your pension increases. It's what we call it uprating. It gets slightly larger each year. Okay. So some UK pensioners who left the UK and moved to other countries such as Australia, their UK pension was frozen at the point when they left the UK. They don't get the uprating. Now, under the withdrawal agreement, we have said that UK state pensioners will continue to receive an uprating of their state pension. And for anyone who's not yet in receipt of their pension, if you're legally resident here by the end of 2020, when you come to claim your pension, so whether that's in 5, 10, 15 years' time, you will also be entitled to an uprated state pension. So that's some good news. Some people might have worked in more than one country, so perhaps you've worked in the UK, you've made contributions here in Spain, you might have worked in another European country. Under the withdrawal agreement, it also says that the aggregation of contributions, so adding up all the different contributions, will still apply to people who are legally resident here by the end of 2020. So your final pension will take into account the different contributions you've made in different countries. It also says that those of you who are receiving exportable benefits from the UK, so there are some benefits you can receive even though you're living here in Spain and they're coming from the UK, that will also continue under the withdrawal agreement. And the last thing I wanted to highlight was about healthcare, because I know that's a really important issue for many of you living here in Spain. Those of you that raised your hand earlier and said that you were UK state pensioners, you might have heard of a form called an S1 form. There's a few people nodding heads. So that form essentially entitles you as a UK state pensioner to free public healthcare here in Spain. Under the withdrawal agreement, that will continue. For anyone legally resident here by the end of 2020, that what we call reciprocal healthcare will continue. And for those of you who are not yet in receipt of your pension, so again, when you come to claim your pension, whether that be in 5-10 years' time, if you're legally resident here by the end of 2020, you will also be entitled to that reciprocal healthcare. So that's just some general information about what the withdrawal agreement, but particularly the citizens' rights aspect, says. But I appreciate that it might not cover everybody's circumstances. So if you have any questions, come and see me at the end. Now you might have noticed that I've said quite a lot, if you are legally resident by the end of 2020. So essentially, as part of the negotiations for our exit, and as part of this implementation period, which is part of that, they have said that these rights that I've just outlined will only apply to people who are legally resident by the end of 2020. Those who become resident after that date won't necessarily have the same rights, because that's part of the future relationship, and that hasn't yet been negotiated. So if you are living here, and you see yourself staying here in Spain, make sure your paperwork is up to date and in order. Now, there are some things which aren't included in the withdrawal agreement, and there are two that I want to mention because I know that they are quite important to the British community here in Spain. One is something we call onward movement. So at the moment, you have the right to move from the UK, live in Spain, and then you can move to France and move to Germany, and you take the same rights with you. Now, the UK wanted to include that right to onward movement within the withdrawal agreement, but the EU said no, that it was something to be discussed as part of the future relationship. So that is an issue which is still, I suppose, pending, if you like, and it's something which I know a lot of people feel very strongly about. The UK's position is that it wants to push for onward movement for those of you who are included within the withdrawal agreement, but that is yet to be negotiated, so we don't yet have a definitive answer on that one. The other thing is voting rights. Has anybody here ever voted in a local election in Spain? Okay, good. Quite a few hands. So those of you who have voted, or even if you haven't, you might be aware that there are local elections in Spain next year, in 2019. Now, voting rights, the right to vote in local elections, is not included in the withdrawal agreement. So there are some countries, and Spain is one of those countries, where the right to vote will not automatically continue once we officially leave the EU in March of next year. But what the UK government has said is that it will seek a bilateral agreement with Spain in order to allow those voting rights to continue. Now, those discussions are underway, but we don't yet have the final answer. We don't yet have the final deal. So when we do have more information about that bilateral deal, then it will be put on our website. The information will be updated on our website, and I'll come back to our website in a minute. But just to say that those of you who have voted or wish to vote next year, you are, under the current rules, still entitled to register to vote now. Okay? So if you're interested in voting next year, make sure you're on the list, and then in the meantime, the discussions about the bilateral agreement will be ongoing. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, well, that's all very well, but what if there's a no deal? I've been reading the news. I can see what's going on in the UK. What if there's a no deal? So the withdrawal agreement isn't signed. What happens then? So withdrawal agreement transition period. Now, I'm not a politician, and unfortunately I don't have a crystal ball, so it wouldn't be fair of me to stand here and speculate about what might or might not happen. So what I'd like to say is a couple of words about what we already know. So we know that the UK government is making contingency plans, and we know that they are starting to publish some information which is relevant for businesses and for citizens. And they're publishing that information in things called technical notices. Now these are quite technical, and as yet they don't cover everything. But there is some information which is on the website, and you can go and have a look at if you're interested. We also know that the European Commission is doing contingency planning, and they are also starting to provide some more information about their plans. So they have recently said, for example, that in the event of a no deal, they don't want to have visas, for example, for short-term travel. That's something which they've recently published, I think it was last week. So they are starting to also provide a bit of information about what would happen in a no deal. On the UK side, I did want to actually just point out that the UK is introducing some legislation at the moment, which is called essentially the healthcare bill. Now this will allow for the UK to put the laws in place to allow the UK to then seek bilateral agreements on things like healthcare, the reciprocal healthcare that I was talking about earlier, in the event of a no-deal scenario. Okay, so the UK is putting plans in place. But the main thing I wanted to highlight in terms of a no deal is what Sarah Jane touched on earlier, and what Theresa May and Pedro Sanchez have said to EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens here in Spain. Now Theresa May made a speech, and you might have seen it, where she publicly said that EU nationals who are living in the UK, even in a no deal scenario, they would be welcome to stay. But she didn't mention UK nationals, and she didn't because the UK cannot unilaterally protect the rights of UK nationals living in all the different European countries. That's for the European countries to do. But Pedro Sanchez did actually recently make a statement, and I wanted to read it to you today because I think it is quite reassuring. It says, "I appreciate and thank very much Prime Minister May's commitment to safeguarding those rights. We will do the same with the 300,000 Britons who are in Spain." So that's a reassuring message from Pedro Sanchez, but you'll notice that he's talked about the 300,000 Britons who are in Spain. Those are the people that are registered and that the Spanish government know are here. So again, if you want to be taken into account in a deal or a no-deal situation, you need to make sure that you are registered so that the different authorities know that you are here. Now, again, I appreciate that no deal might raise quite a few questions for you personally, so I'm very happy to take those questions one-to-one here at the end. But I just wanted to finish on what you can do in order to stay up to date, because I understand it can be confusing. I understand there's a lot of information out there. But I wanted to highlight 2 pages on the internet, which I think are really important. So some of you might have got this leaflet on your way in, and you'll see at the very bottom there's a section which says "Concerned about Brexit?" with a question mark. So on there, we are pointing you to our government website, which is www.gov.uk. Now, the government website is a monster. It's huge. It contains information about everything. But there are 2 pages on there which I think are relevant to all of you in the room today. On the front page of gov.uk, there's a search box. And if you type into that search box, UK nationals in the EU, it comes up with a page specifically designed for people such as yourselves. UK nationals who are living in an EU country. It explains the withdrawal agreement in more detail, it gives you an update as to where we've got to with the negotiations, and it also provides links to further information if you're interested. So that would be page number 1. And the other page is what we call our Living in Spain guide. Now, Living in Spain guide is essentially a guide for people who are living in Spain. It's very imaginatively titled. It covers things like residency, driving, property, a whole host of information. And that is where we will be updating information as and when it becomes available for people specifically living in Spain. So say the voting rights, for example, that I mentioned earlier. As soon as we have information about that, it will go on that Living in Spain guide, and it will tell you what you need to do, if anything. Now, in order to know when that information has been updated, you can sign up for email alerts. So if you're on the internet, if you've got access to email, make sure you sign up for alerts, not just for the Living in Spain guide, but for Brexit in general. And then as and when any information on gov.uk changes or is announced, an email will go straight into your inbox, and you will be among the first people to know about it. And it will provide a link to take you directly to that information. And then finally, you'll notice that we've also got a Facebook page, which is called Brits in Spain. This is just another vehicle that we use in order to get messages out. And again, as a social media page, it's updated really regularly. So if there's anything which is announced, if there's any new information, then it will also go on Brits in Spain. So if you're following us on Facebook, that's another way that you can find out the latest. Now that's all I wanted to say today, so thank you very much for listening. I will be here, as I said, answering questions at the end, so do come and see me if you